G'day, welcome again to the Ancient Warfare podcast. Today we're going to talk about Ancient Warfare issue 7.4, Logistics and the Army Train. I'm Josho, and joining me today again are our members of the regular panel, Lindsay Powell, Michael Taylor, and Murray Down. This issue was a difficult one to when I was confronted with it, because this was still an issue that was originally created when Jasper was still doing Ancient Warfare magazine. So I was sort of saddled with most of the themes for volume 7. Starting with volume 8, all the themes are basically my own fault, with thanks to the readers, of course. And this issue, the theme, when I saw it, I was thinking, oh my goodness, this is going to be an incredible, difficult one to find decent articles for, and I got a relatively large amount of proposals, most of them also interesting, though it didn't prove to be as much of a challenge as I thought, even though of course there are loads of problems that are touched upon in the articles that we will undoubtedly return to in this podcast. The end result is a fairly wide-ranging number of articles dealing with problems relating to logistics, movement of the army, and problems of supply, ranging from the Assyrians, to touch on something early, the Babylonians, even to some Greek stuff and Persian stuff, and of course the Romans, including some comments on late Roman baggage trains. But before we get cracking, I think it's time to listen to Michael Taylor's brief introduction on the issue.
There is an aphorism that amateurs study tactics, but professionals study logistics. This was as true in the ancient world as it is today. While ancient armies might from time to time live off the land, an army doing so is like a shark. It must keep moving or perish, as few regions had sufficient agricultural surplus to support tens of thousands of hungry men for more than a few weeks. While foraging was an important method of supplementing external forms of supply, it also carried its own strategic and tactical risks. Foraging slowed armies down, while dispersed units of foragers were vulnerable to enemy attack. The more supplies that could be concentrated and moved along established supply lines at predictable rates, the better. The scale of army supply was enormous, especially when one considers the primitive transportation technology of the period. A Roman legion of 5,200 infantry and 300 cavalry consumed roughly 2,000 tons of wheat and 200 tons of barley a year. Tentage for that same legion might require 30,000 cowhides. During the Republic, an army of 25,000 men required about 300 to 400 transport ships to support it. Logistical systems in the ancient world were diverse. A Germanic warrior raiding across the Rhine might carry almost no food at all, eating only what could be stolen or pillaged along the way. A Roman army invading in the other direction, across the Rhine, might have grain ships sail in from the Atlantic to meet advancing troops. As a rule, the Greeks were less serious about logistics than the Romans. Oftentimes, Greek armies were simply given cash to purchase grain from private contractors who followed the army, so that a commander's logistical problem simply meant providing for an orderly marketplace. The Romans proved particularly sophisticated logisticians, and this must be a major explanatory factor of Roman success overseas. The problems of supplying Roman armies in Sicily during the First Punic War honed Roman logistical methods, allowing them to launch overseas campaigns that seem oddly effortless. In the Empire, as the legions shifted into permanent bases, the logistics of the Roman army combined local sourcing with the collection and consumption of staples raised across the empire. A unit stationed on the Rhine might eat olive oil from Spain, grain from Africa, with a side of local beef and a glass of local beer to wash it down. The consideration of logistics had to be integrated into every level of planning, from the general deciding how many days of rations to issue his troops, to the strategic level of logistics. For example, if an army planned to live off of foraging, it was essential that it had sufficient cavalry to screen work parties as they collected supplies. Supremacy at sea was an essential prerequisite to ensure transmarine shipping. Thus, Roman control of the seas from the First Punic War onwards was particularly decisive in allowing Rome to logistically support expeditionary operations throughout the Mediterranean. The end result of complex logistics was quite mundane. The standard ration for both the Roman and the Greek soldier was about the same: 1 choinix of wheat a day, weighing about 2 pounds, containing enough calories to fuel a physically active young man. Just as a kingdom was lost for want of a horseshoe nail, the political history of the Mediterranean oftentimes hinged on 2 pounds of wheat.
Well, that was Michael's introduction. To sort of kick off this podcast, we've decided to start with questions that were posted on the History Network's Facebook page. And one interesting one was posted by Harvey Sietsema. He had an interest in how logistic trains differed from one era to the next, for example, from late Roman and Byzantine.
Yeah, well, I think one of the big issues, of course, is that the texts that tell us are all classicizing anyway. So they talk about, they talk about baggage train, like when they've got the description of the march. They don't really give you a lot of information about what the baggage train is. It's just this thing that's mentioned in the, the Maurice and the other texts. So I think that's the other thing, is that a lot of those texts are in fact classicizing and putting themselves back in what they perceive to be the classical Roman period, which is why you get this sort of perception that 1,000 years of Roman military history is very similar, whereas I think the classical Roman Marius's mule that we'll talk about later, and then the idea of sort of Roman imperial, good old classical Lorica Segmentata legionaries stays throughout the next sort of, 600 years without change. But we know that there must have been change, because there's changes in equipment, there's changes in formation, there's changes in organization. So they must have all had some form of effect on the logistics of the army, and especially when you start to get far more cavalry-based armies, they can roam and forage much farther than an infantry-based army.
The word for baggage in Latin is impedimenta, which is a wonderful word. It sort of invokes that idea that stuff that you've got to lug around and it's in the way and it's a bloody nuisance, but we've got to have it. Of course, it's said that armies march on their stomachs. Of course, if you bring the cavalry, I mean, they eat on their stomachs too. So the whole idea that really this is something that needs to be managed, you get the sense that inherent in it there's a planning function. It is supply chain management, as we nowadays call it. I think it raises a whole bunch of questions like who's in charge, how do you organize it, how long does it last, when it runs out, what do you do? And I guess the different armies, the commanders, and the cultures, depending on the period that you're talking about, handle these things in different ways. Clearly, by the time you get to the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, it's a very sophisticated professional army. My impression is that the further back in time you go, armies are often brought together for a campaign season. So there would probably be quite a short period to do the planning of the logistics. And like, for example, Trajan and his Dacian wars, where they could plan 1-2 years in advance. The fact that, the Italian allies are in revolt 91, let's say, BC, doesn't give you a lot of time to get organized. So you scale your abilities according to circumstances and all the other things that play into this.
Yeah.
I don't think logistics changed very much depending on era. I also don't think that it changed very much depending from one culture to the other. I think what's mostly important is the scale and the sophistication of the bureaucracy more than a particular culture or a particular era. Because I think that when the Egyptians, for example, in the New Kingdom go and embark on campaigns in the Levant, I don't think that will be any less sophisticated than something that the Romans would do 1,500 years later. In its very essentials, I think. I think that the basics would be more or less the same. I think it's different in scale and in organization. If you have a very small army or a war band, it will be much easier to find enough supplies than when you have a very big army. compare, for example, Herodotus' descriptions of the Persian army, where they march and they're sort of like a swarm of locusts. They eat everything and they drink the rivers dry. And undoubtedly it's an exaggeration, but it sort of gives an idea of problems. And I think that would have been the same from one period to the other, basically, and would have been solved in similar manners also. I think there's not a lot of variation that you can apply, but maybe I'm missing something.
There are at times the basic need to just provide people with grain and firewood and water and tents. I think that does remain very stable throughout the period. Certainly, what may shift is the solutions to those kind of constant problems. So, think about like Xenophon's Anabasis, which we did the recent magazine edition. The logistics of that very large army are solved by having a marketplace basically follow the army, and then all these traders come and sort of wholesale grain to the soldiers. There's no sort of sense of a quartermaster corps doing that. It's actually just sort of the one thing that Cyrus, as the general, does is provide a market and sort of regulate it. But that's not a kind of bureaucracy solving that problem. It's just the traders come, they sell food to the soldiers, and then everyone's happy. And then you compare that to, say, a Roman army from the Republic on, where the state is, through very sophisticated means, culling grain from across the Mediterranean and getting it to armies that are, in some instances, quite far afield. You might have a soldier, on the Rhine eating grain from Sicily or something. So it's the same problem. How do we get, a pound of grain a day to a Roman soldier, or so 2 pounds a day to a soldier? But there certainly are some variation in the solution that is sort of interesting to see, both over time and just different states coming up with different solutions to the same basic problem. People got to eat and all that good stuff.
And that really was my point. So, for example, if you looked at, I've recently written about Drusus Germanicus, in Germania specifically, it's clear that they actually, as part of the campaign planning and rollout of the plan itself over the 4 or 5 years, they built installations specifically for logistics. So it is a fort with nothing but barns in it, or granaries and so on. Rungen is a famous case in point, and clearly that they had to consider the transportation distances between a fortified camp and where they could have these supply dumps. So you sort of have these interspersed at 1 or 2 days' march, and they're supplied by a river. So clearly there's a very well worked out system there. And amazingly, if you look at the Oberraden fortress, for example, they've even got peppercorns from India that they found in the ground. So it gives a testament to the enormous diversity of stuff. And I would imagine it was reflected somewhat in the officers could afford to have the exotic spices. The men probably would be lucky to get salt. But if you, as you were saying earlier, if you compare that to Alexander the Great, you get the general sense of it being a little bit more on the fly.
Yeah, I think scale, distance, time, and experience. I've just decided that those 4 things are the most important. So for a marathon, for instance, it was basically have a good breakfast and we'll go and fight a battle. It doesn't need to be any more than that for the Battle of Marathon. They march out, they fight, they march back, famously. Something like the Battle of Thermopylae, for instance, you've got no evidence of what they do, and it certainly isn't something that Herodotus likes to dwell on in terms of how these people were supplied. And the idea of there being, 4,000 hoplites, and however many Spartans there were in terms of how many helots were servicing them. If it is 7 per Spartiate, then you've got 7 servants gathering for you, presumably from the surrounding area, or carrying for you, but we don't know. But then as you start to get these longer expeditions, as you say, Alexander the Great, it could have been, more disorganized in the sense of go and forage and, strip the land bare to feed our army, and that the idea that, as you do with medieval armies, as they get further and further into enemy territory, they have to forage further and further afield to find enough food to feed their army. And then by the Roman period, you've got a really sophisticated, as you say, logistics chain, which is years in advance in terms of planning and forward planning and creating supply dumps that can supply vast amounts of men for vast amounts of time.
And that's not to say the Egyptians, for example, to take Josho's point, weren't doing this as well. I think it comes down to, are you in a defensive reactionary modus, which is, I think, one of the things that you were alluding to there. Thermopylae, you've got to go out, you've got to deal with an immediate threat, imminent threat, as opposed to, we are going to make a campaign of war against our neighbor. And then you have the advantage because you know when you're going to launch the actual campaign, so you can actually scale and plan for it. And of course, if you're on the other side, it has the opposite advantage or disadvantage that you have to respond to it, but it also, depending on how much you've got stored in your granaries, will tell you how far you can go to defend your position. And to give you an example, again, when the Romans are marching through Germany, they come back, and the Catti have been working with against the Sugambri, and the Sugambri have to go back because they know if they don't get there before the end of summer, they can't get their wheat in, their grain from the fields. So in other words, those kind of basic lacks of foresight foreshorten their ability to actually run their campaign, to run their war.
It depends on the infrastructure that you're able to put in place. If you're on the defensive, you probably have some sort of infrastructure if you have any kind of large-scale organization. So you can have outposts with food, and you know that you can requisition from villages or whatever. But if you're, especially when you're invading, I guess you don't have to. It's more seat by the pants, of course, kind of conquest. So you sort of have to make do unless you have a standing army. I guess that's one major difference that I didn't mention between, as far as organization is concerned. If you have a standing army that is better organized than more like a volunteer or a militia army, you probably have that infrastructure to carry with you, which is of course a different kettle of fish.
Taking up that theme about the market that goes with the Parthian, the Persian army, rather. It reminds me that, for example, I'm sure part of the Roman economy, certainly in the frontier, in the pro-praetorian public provinces, under Augustus and his successors, was premised on the fact that you had this working model where private enterprise supports and provides materiel to the army, in addition to which there's this trade in taxes. For example, the Frisi, or the Cananifatis, they have to provide so many skins of this animal, and that's their tribute for the year, which is essential because we need that much material to make, shield covers or whatever it is that you need. But it has, I think, a very important role in motoring the economy along as well. So I think part of the success of the Roman model, and certainly as it goes towards the Byzantine era, is that you have the economy in lockstep with the military, and this government and military bureaucracy kind of all working together. And I think by the time you get to the Byzantine period, they're the same.
Yeah, you have these. With the Romans, of course, also a big Roman army would have been followed by merchants and prostitutes and whatever, blacksmiths, in order to earn some money. You also see that very clearly, for example, here in the Netherlands, in the frontier zone that existed with the Roman fortified border. You had the Roman forts and the roads leading to the forts, and from the forts you would have merchants basically pitch a tent, and a small town would develop, which was ribbon-shaped all along the road, where the merchants would basically found a small settlement and would surface the fort. And usually, or often, what you would see is that the fort was abandoned, the settlement was also abandoned. So you're right, it goes hand in hand, this sort of mix of public organization, state organization, and this sort of commercial insight of private individual.
Interesting, one of the letters from Vindelander, as I recall, is basically, I think, an appeal by a foreign merchant who feels that he's been very badly treated by the local soldiers, and he basically appeals, I'm a Roman citizen, I'm entitled to have my say, and clearly got rough treatment by the local squaddies, as it were. The other thing I remember is reading that receipts survive, I think, from Oxyrhynchus or one of those places, where there's a case of a cavalryman loses his horse, and they have to go requisition another one. So what we actually have basically is the purchase order to go get another horse. It's a bit like, oh, sorry, I've lost my F-15. Can I have another F-15?
Another interesting question here is posed by John Roke. To what extent did the Romans adapt previous cultures' logistical systems? Or did they develop a new system that would influence armies beyond the Roman period?
the big adaptation that they take is after the First Punic War, when the Romans sort of acquire a sphere of influence in Sicily, in particular after they've basically literally annexed eastern Sicily following the Second Punic War. They basically adapt that tax system that the Sicilian Syracuse has been using to collect taxes. They keep it the same, the sort of Sicilian tithe. And the result is they are able to collect huge amounts of grain every year, because Sicily is one of the big sort of bread baskets of the Mediterranean. And as a result, they have sort of a big stockpile of grain with which to supply their army. So that's an instance where the kings of Syracuse are taxing in a certain way simply because that's just how they collect their revenues. The Romans don't really change that. They need that grain anyway, and that's why they have sort of this fantastic logistical base almost to begin with, in that there's so much grain in Sicily. They have a pre-existing method of extracting it, and every time there's a big war in the east, they can not only take the main tithe, they oftentimes will institute a double tithe. So they basically fall into a method of extracting grain, and they can get a lot of it, and that is a major boon to them anytime they need to raise an army of 6, 8, 10 legions. They've got the grain to feed them.
You know when the frumentarii as a sort of a part of the army sort of first come into being?
By late antiquity, they're a sort of nasty secret police force that goes around, doing all kinds of unpleasant things to people.
They were supposedly, the idea of frumentarius or something apparently is connected with grain or distribution or collection of it, and the supposition is that because they were out in the community, presumably gathering supplies, not just grain but other things presumably, is that they were able to, if you like, monitor the news flow, and they could take that intelligence back, and that became the basis for their ideas as sort of a secret service, as it were.
Certainly the Romans have agents who go around requisitioning grain, buying grain from a very early period. I think a lot of it tends to be more informal, and even during really all periods, but particularly during the Republic, it's not uncommon for the Romans to simply order a community to deliver a certain amount of grain, and then the community will, through its own sort of mechanisms, collect that grain, make sure it's dropped off at the right point. And that actually will remain a very common way of requisition, is have someone else do it for you so you don't have to commit the people or the agents or things like that. Because going out and to a broad agricultural space and collecting grain farmer by farmer is actually pretty tough to do and takes a lot of people and is highly inefficient.
I think it comes back to this idea that, once again, if you have an organized state, you can do these things obviously much better, because clearly you've got an infrastructure, be it roads or rivers and fleets and so on, but you presumably have ministers and their bureaucracies and scribes and so on who use a writing system to be able to keep check of things and move things around. And the impression I get with the Egyptian system, it was very centralized, I would imagine. With the Roman system, by definition, because of the scale of the empire, had to be quite decentralized to fort level, and you get into the issue of then this vast amount of money spent on keeping records, daily rosters and receipts, and again, Vindeland is a great place for finding people sort of not paying their bills, wonderful sort of insights into their everyday life like that. And then when you get into the later periods, again, it presumably becomes once again much more centralized. But to the extent to which they learned it from other people, it was very hard to stay. My general impression is that the pre-1st century BC army was really one of the Roman people as soldiers engaging in an annual campaign when they're called to, because there's a treaty ally needs help, or they go off because they're motivated to do something. In the 1st century beyond, once you get past the sort of the Marius reform, so-called, and those great privateers, if you will, the Caesars and the Crassuses of the world, and Pompeius Magnus, who really sort of begin to make personal, professional armies, they probably pay much more attention to those things, because clearly, in order to be able to sustain long campaigns, they need to do that sort of stuff. I mean, you've got like an 8-9 year war in Gaul, probably 5 or 6 years in the east with Pompeius Magnus, and then by the time you get to Augustus and his period, I mean, you've got For example, you've got these great rebellions that break out, so the Illyrian revolt, revolts in Germany, all over the place, it turns out, a lot of the time. So the needs of the system to have this buffer to be able to draw on stores of grain and meat, at relatively short notice is part of their response mechanism.
In terms of the influences on the Romans, and yes, they do fall in on some methods of taxation and extraction, but in terms of the sort of actual mechanics of military logistics, I would say they learned a lot of that themselves, and they by the time they start confronting these big Hellenistic kingdoms, they do it much, much better than sort of any Macedonian-style king can. And I would assume that is in part because of the First Punic War, that they maybe at times bungle through it, but they if you spend 20 plus years fighting over Sicily, you get really good at putting grain and men and horses into boats, shipping those boats over to an island, disembarking them, putting veterans back in, and you do that enough, and you kind of start developing a sort of institutional knowledge that seems to stick. And you look at when some of the later Hellenistic kings try to launch a seaborne invasion, it's a disaster. They don't know how to do it. Philip V has to barter for dates because his men are starving when he invades Caria. When Antiochus III invades Greece, he doesn't have the ships. He doesn't know how to get the ships together and get his troops on ships, and he lands with this tiny force because he can't support anything bigger. So again, the Romans are certainly willing to take over, somebody's tax system or something like that. But in terms of a lot of the nuts and bolts of military logistics and launching an overseas campaign, they learn a lot. They figure out a lot on their own, and they do it very, very well. Which must obviously be a major factor in why they end up being the ones who, there's a Roman Empire, and we're not talking about the Macedonian Empire or something.
Yeah.
One of the things that occurred to me when I was doing my research into Germanicus was in that period of 14, 15, 16, when, of course, he's active in Germany, was the fact of, in I think the end of the first campaign, the official campaign, he had a complete disaster. He lost his fleet, lost men and material. It was a disaster. And the response of the Tres Galliae, the three Gallic provinces, was to rally round and basically say, "We'll help you with, we'll help you rebuild the army." And I think that's interesting that the province, the region of which the governor in that particular case is the place, is the go-to honeypot, if you will, where you get the resources. What I'm saying is, you can't turn to Rome and say, "Oh, can you cut me a line of credit, please, so I can go buy stuff?" The impression I'm getting looking at that one particular story is, no, you have to kind of refer to the resources within your own area of control, because, after all, you are the governor. And to re-emphasize that point, in the second or third year, I forget which one of the campaign, Germanicus has to send his own deputies, his own legates, down to Lugdunum to actually rally the finances together. He has to sort of basically butter up some local Celtic chiefs and city elders in order to be able to get the money. So there's another side to this, which is that, yes, they can get these things one way, but some of these things just come back to you have to do us a favor. And, oh, by the way, I'm the man in charge, and you're going to do that favor for me.
Yeah, I think the role of diplomacy is, as we were alluding to before, when you demand from a community that they provide X for you here on this date. I think that's something else that's long-standing as well. It was one of the theories about why Philip of Macedon is a Medizer, is because he basically accommodates them as they go through. And that must have been, the Persian king's massive invasion. He just would have sent diplomatic missions ahead to say, "I'm coming with 5 million men, you'll feed them." So, you wanted them through you as fast as possible because, feasting, the entourage and the army would have been horrendous on your economy. But as diplomatic relations, it was required, or else you'd be treated much less fairly.
So there's one point that was raised about the Romans adopting the Sicilian tax system. That's something that you see, of course, a lot with good conquerors, at least. That as soon as they get into a country, they don't immediately destroy the existing infrastructure, but they use the existing infrastructure and adopt it for their own purposes. And I think one of the things that the Romans did, of course, that makes them remarkable is that the Romans, where they didn't just conquer other states, for example. But they also, of course, conquered areas such as in Gaul, such as in Spain, where you didn't have a very sophisticated existing infrastructure, and they sort of built that on top of that. And I'm wondering if that maybe is also a factor that strengthened the Romans in, our way is the best, and that sort of made them lead the way in that regard.
It sounds very convincing, and if you remember that every 5 years, every lustrum, they're supposed to have a census where they're looking at people's property, the ability to create wealth, how many olive trees, and this type of thing. And that becomes a very important part of the governor's function, is in fact to have the census. And it appears to be that they were kind of roving around the country rather than necessarily the Bible story, everybody has to go to one particular place. But that was quite a big event. My suspicion is you're right, that the difficulty is in those proconsular provinces where you had sort of senatorial governors notoriously favor fleecing the local people. It seems to be that there you had a privatized tax collecting system, and that went rather wrong. So in other words, what you're suggesting might be in the first years it was okay because they left you alone a little bit to run affairs, to see how you were able to bring in wealth, and after that then the machine came in and then they started to kind of really milk you.
Yeah, the private tax collecting is something you also see in classical Greece, for example, where they when the state needs money, or it is decided that they need money for some particular purpose, they auction off the tax rights, basically. So a rich man would say, okay, you need 20,000 drachmas, I will give you 20,000 drachmas, and then he has to go and collect the taxes, and then usually he would use.
And the same, in fact, during in the years immediately after Julius Caesar's assassination, again the Greek cities were lent on by the likes of Crassus and Brutus, quite brutally, as it turns out, and you can understand why. When they were completely fleeced and bled dry, that along came the opposite. They were quite prepared to join Antony and Octavian because they actually appeared to be the lesser of the two evils, as it were. And there's a famous story, I think, with Corinth, where I forget who the writer was, that the citizens were expected to actually go out and actually haul the grain bags and so on onto the ships, and these were free Greek citizens, and they were none too pleased about that.
Let's move on to, I hope I'm saying this correctly, David Polishek? Please, if I'm saying this wrong, forgive me. He posted a number of related questions. I will start with the first. How did the greater mobility that the decent road network gave the Roman army compare with medieval or later armies that lacked decent roads but had more efficient horse and carts, for example? Did this lead to the Romans being less locust-like when transiting friendly country?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. There's a couple of assumptions based in that question. One of which is that, to read it, says more efficient horse and carts. I'm not quite sure the medieval world actually did have more efficient horses and carts, did they? I think by definition, if you have a hard metalled road, military road, a highway, you move your troops faster. I mean, that was something that Hitler and his army did when they put the Autobahn in Germany. Of course, it was understood this was the fast highway to get your troops out. My understanding is that some of the first Roman roads, in fact, I think, were really to connect strategic towns within Italy itself, so Capua and all the way, I guess, down to Brundisium and so on. And it's only, in the hundreds BC, I suppose, that the network starts to build out more formally, and then you get right through to Julius Caesar's and Augustus, that it becomes much more strategic. But I think inherent in the question is a misunderstanding. I think the medieval period wasn't as efficient as the ancient world, certainly the Roman period, and I think that the fact that the road network was a key part of the military's duty. It built them, it had surveyors to lay these things out, and the men actually went out, ordinary legionaries would have done it, shows the very high value, the strategic and tactical value that they placed on these things. It seems to me that it was a means to connect fortresses, which again were supply dumps in some cases, or there would have been installations and watchtowers and various other things of that nature. But that was part of their success, was the fact that they were able to mobilize and get from A to B, the proverbial A to B. What is it? Vegetius says, I think something like 14 miles in a day, and a forced march was 20.
I think the other thing though is that the roads are obviously within the Roman Empire once it's pacified and it's a peacetime operation. That when you're invading, anywhere new, you are going to necessarily be locust-like, but also that there are other road systems and other trackway systems within all of these countries that are being invaded. I think the idea that they are green fields of no visible form of roadway is false. That all of these cultures that the Romans invade and then impose Romanitas on have systems of roadways and trackways and ways you get from A to B that invading armies take. I know that in the Parthian Wars, there's only really two routes which are predicated by, well, you need to go this one because it has a water source, or this one because you avoid vast plains of desert. So in that regard, they when they invade, they would have to be locust-like, but at the same time there are other systems of transport and roadways, and then once they've Romanized an area and they impose their road system, then their ability to respond to crises is faster because they can get from A to B much quicker.
It's interesting, for example, in the famous Teutoburg disaster, I think it's at the first or second day when the Roman army supposedly is diverted off. You read the story, I think it's in either Vellis Paterculus or Cassius Dio, of how the engineers are having to fell trees and build bridges. So what that reminds you of is the fact that within the Roman army, at any moment in time, they are changing the landscape as they move forward. And then ahead of those, of course, are the exploratores, one day, half a day, a couple of hours away, going out and basically saying, the enemy is over there. And then, of course, I guess what they're doing is they're adjusting their forward march according to either intelligence coming back or a strategic goal they're after, because you have to imagine that they don't just willy-nilly march north. I mean, they have a goal in mind to get there. They probably know where the oppidum of the enemy tribe is, let's assume, or there's a particular mountain they're trying to get to, and they'll try and get there by various means. And in order just to physically move this whole logistical supply chain of men, material, and animals, by the fastest route, they're physically digging stuff out the way. They're sort of, in a sense, creating roads.
It's also the sheer size of an army, of course. You have to imagine that when an army sets off to march, that the rear guard would have to wait maybe a few hours before they can actually get moving as well. It's like this big snake going through the forest in this case. But that would also, that's one of the reasons why it makes it so slow going also. I can imagine that it will be ample time to sort of carve out this path, like sort of trailblazing vanguard. I don't know.
It's always easier to operate where someone else has built the road ahead of time, which is why the going's so tough in Germany, and it's a little easier to mop up, Greece and Macedonia and the east, where there's already, maybe not perfectly beautiful flinted roads, but yeah, good road systems, track systems, wagon roads, things like that. So it helps if someone else has built the infrastructure that you use to conquer them.
One of the signs of conquest was when Roman roads were built. If you have felled a pathway, that's one thing, but when the Romans have actually built a road in your territory, you're pacified. When they feel that they can transit your territory without any worries, I think you're in serious trouble.
And by the way, this is one of the frustrations of modern German archaeology, is that we know from the various sources the Romans were building roads across Germany, Germania, but we don't know where they are. And it's quite a fascinating idea that, and again, this recent discovery in just in the last few months in Thuringen, for example, suggests that that they once again were moving in, and they were probably building on previous campaigns, and they were using routes already established by previous legions marching that way. So they would make adjustments as their intelligence got better, as of course that they learned. Actually, there's a route, if you go around behind there, you'll save yourself a day's march. You won't go through the bog. But I think that there must have been a lot of, to take your theme about the existing pathways, roadways that they could obviously leverage and exploit. And there must have been a lot of kind of temporary trackways. The famous Pontes Longhi by Ahenobarbus built somewhere, we don't even know where that was in Germany, By the time Germanicus's generals get back to that, it's rotting. It's not being maintained. Arminius knows this, and in fact, they tried to drive the Roman army under, I think it's Caecina Severus, across it. And one of the things that the Romans have to do as part of their escape is repair, literally as they move it, they're trying to repair the sodden corduroy road. And in fact, as they sleep in their temporary camp, the Germans manage to divert a river, so the story goes, and they actually flood the works again. So guess what? Next morning, the Romans have to go back at this corduroy road actually to effect their escape.
But I think it's also what Michael was talking about in terms of institutional knowledge, that, we don't have anyone writing a handbook of, if you invade Germany, take the left fork. And so there must be this sort of like, well, I heard from a centurion who was in XYZ's army, and when they were here, they went around the Great Hill and da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
I actually think that, again, because if you look at the preparations that, for example, that Drusus the Elder put in to invade Germany in like 14 through 12 and then all the way through 9 BC, and then subsequently Ahenobarbus and Marcus Vinicius and Tiberius, and ultimately goes back to Germanicus, is that they're building their base of intelligence all the way. And I have to imagine, because everything else that we know about the Romans is they wrote things down. They were meticulous bureaucrats. They wrote things down. They had maps. Marcus Agrippa has famously his Orbis Terrarum, which supposedly is either a detailed list of things, distances and sizes of things, or it may physically have been a map with different things, and ultimately we get to the Tabula Peutingeriana. So we know these things existed. I suspect that there were many campaign maps that were in the Principii of the forts, which were probably held in high regard because these were hand-drawn things which were annotated and added to, and they were probably copied over and over and over and distributed. And as they spread out, and they could supplement it with intelligence from merchants or captured whoever it was, the various sources they had, they could build this rich intelligence. So I think they knew more about the outside world in pretty short time, and there probably was, maybe in the first go, yes, we don't know where things are, but I think very quickly they build this knowledge up.
None of that survives, which is one of the big frustrations. But then there's all these, someone told me to go here, so I went there kind of stuff. There's in Pliny the Elder, there's the Roman equestrian who gets told by Nero that he's got to go to the Baltic to get amber. And so off he goes, and he obviously goes on the amber route, which is one of these sort of Neolithic onwards pathways that exists, and quite complex in terms of the territory it has to traverse. But, he just goes there and comes back. So there must have been a combination of written knowledge, pictorial knowledge, so to speak, and, trusting your local guide. I think all those things, but I think institutionalized knowledge is something that's obviously lost to us because it's not something that we can, it's not what's written down by the great men when they write their histories.
And that's part of the problem. It's like, we were talking about logistics chain. Slaves or freedmen were all part of that, and they're invisible to us. They're all part of this impedimenta, whatever, man material. And it seems to be that maybe they had a greater function in the running of the army than maybe they're given credit for. Not just carrying stuff, but doing other things as well. And of course, there were also the lixi, who were these sort of traders or sutlers, and also sort of the slave traders as well. So there's all these different people playing into this that they're invisible. So once again, we have this tantalizing look into what could be, but no proof to actually say it was true.
We do know the scouts, for example, were used to sort of scout ahead and see whether there was what kind of terrain there was, where the enemy was, and of course also to see if there were any usable supplies. So you sort of have to imagine this large baggage train with all of the impedimenta, indeed, with all the ox carts and everything else, and traders and merchants and everyone, and then sort of this screen of scouts sort of making sure that the army isn't ambushed, and also to see what was ahead and where supplies were and which people would be friendly disposed towards the army to give them supplies and stuff like that. So it's the bigger the army, the more massive the operation would have been.
I don't want to come back to David Ilchuk's question, but the last part of that, which is rather dramatically written, locust-like, which is a very evocative expression. is the idea that if you don't plan your campaign well, things go horribly wrong. And I'm thinking there was a campaign, I think it was in the 20s BC to Arabia Felix. I think it was Asinius, it was Aelius Gallus, I think, or Caius Petronius, one of those two. And the story goes that off they marched thinking that they knew what they were doing. And if you read the sources, you get the impression they're walking into the desert. And I don't know if that's true or not, but their supplies run out. These men are suffering with these horrible sort of heat stroke bouts. And it turns out there was a very simple cure for this thing, but they didn't know what it was. And eventually it's kind of nature and their lack of the basic resources and supplies that wipes his army out. So there's somebody who didn't plan very well, and probably didn't have roads, maybe, and did locust-like go ahead and suffer very badly.
Well, the same sort of thing happened with Alexander's army when they decided to march back to Babylon, when his men refused to continue. There's also a great tactical mistake made in how the army is, the route that they take marching back. It probably hasn't been scouted properly, and a lot of the army dies.
It's the ultimate test, isn't it, of a good general? I mean, has he done all the basics? Like he's thought all the things through, a bit like Sun Tzu. You have to spend many hours in the planning, otherwise you'll spend many hours in the regretting. So there's lots of examples in history of that. But the idea that Romans tended to be less locust-like because they had roads. Murray's got a good point. If you're starting from scratch and you don't have any roads, clearly you have to be locust-like. When you've actually gone, for example, for one campaign, you've probably got trackways that if you haven't borrowed from someone else, you've actually built yourself, and then you build on top of those, because of course in the meantime you've got a supply chain of forts, temporary or semi-permanent, and you may be using rivers and all the rest of it to move your men and material to the frontier.
Speaking of forts, this is a good link, I think. Another part of the question was, how long did it take to set up and strike a fortified or a non-fortified marching camp, and how effective were these to protect troops in hostile territory?
Well, I think the supposition is that at the end of every day's march, the Roman army is supposed to be digging a camp. The first legion or unit to march off is the one that's given the task of actually having to build a camp when they get there. So when the last ones from the old camp get there, they've got somewhere to go, if I could put it that way. Everybody has two sudes or stakes, whether they're stuck in the ground or tied together like a sort of an X shape, not quite sure. So the supposition, it's in a matter of hours at the end of every day's route march, that they're all over the Roman Empire. They're in places like Wales, where they've been found through crop marks. They're now being found in Germany in places that we didn't think the Romans went to. For example, Alphen, and this most recent one in Thüringen is a case in point. The surprise is how wide and deep the ditch was. I think it's anything from 1 meter to 3 meters. I guess the deeper and wider, depending on the assessed hostility of the area that you're in. And some of these things, depending on the period you're talking about, can either be rectangular or very odd shapes. It seems to be under Augustus there wasn't this familiar playing card design of forts necessarily. It often followed the contours of the hill. So at Oberaden, or even which was a sort of semi-permanent camp with I think near the Lippe River, it's sort of oval shape, which is a little unusual if you're expecting a rectangular playing card shape.
It would be an interesting thing to test, by the way, whether the depth and the width of the trenches at the Roman forts are indicative of the hostility of the environment. But yeah, no, it's. I think it's. I think we covered it on a previous podcast also, where the conclusion was that the army, on the Roman army at least on the march, built these forts first of all in order to protect themselves and indeed to give the men, when they had arrived, somewhere to go to, but also to give the ones that had arrived at the place early, so in the vanguard and the legions, whatever. To give them something to do.
Do we know if the rearguard was the unit tasked with striking camp? In terms of returning to that point earlier of that, the rearguard would be standing around for a few hours. They maybe were the ones who were told, well, strike, and then they sort of rotate who has to make and who has to strike camp, and who gets a down day.
I think that's right, and in fact they're drawn by lots. Again, if you read the sort of stories of Germanicus traipsing through Germania in sort of 15 and 16, one of the things you find in Tacitus, he tells you that they're in the van and they're in the rear, and then the next day they're rotated round. And I guess the sense of honor being at the front rather than being at the back, because being at the back, of course, you literally are at the back. I mean, you could be attacked. That's part of the challenge. I think there's another aspect to the camp, which is you've got a lot of animals, pack animals. You've got cavalry. You've got mules and all the other things that go. And of course, some of them act as food, live food, of course. And if you look at Hedemunden Roman fort on the Werra River, what's very interesting is that you have the fort itself and these very strange ditches and shapes on the outside of it, and it's almost as though they're enclosures for other animals or things. They're dumped separate to the main area. Of course, they could have also been for the camp followers. I mean, they're supposedly not allowed inside, but if you're going to be in relatively hostile country and you're not allowed inside, you can probably build your own little sort of defensive position, mimicking what's being done by the main army. So it's a discipline they do all the time. The other thing I think is interesting. Sometimes they will build one for the summer. They have the winter camps at the permanent bases, and they have summer camps, which, for example, I think the one recently discovered at Minden Gap or Porta Westfalica, everybody was saying it's Varus's camp, and I'm not sure if there's any conclusive evidence for that. But it's a fairly substantial camp, and presumably it's a base of operations for that year's campaigning or whatever the mission is. And people then radiate from there, and they go to their watchtowers and road stations and all various other sorts of things. So what you end up with is sort of like a hub and spoke arrangement. You have your winter camp, you go off into some territory, you build a summer camp for the 3 months that you're going to be there, and the units break off to do particular different things, and at the end of the season, presumably all come back together and then march back to the winter camp.
I mean, the other thing I think is that 5,000 or 10,000 or 20,000 men with spades is a huge workforce that can do a lot of things incredibly quickly, especially if they know what they're doing, you know, if they have to dig a particular section of trench or palisade. The other thing is, of course, that throughout the Roman Empire, whenever discipline lapses in the legions, the method that the generals say that they use to restore discipline is forced marches and camp building. That they make their men, you know, do the things that were traditionally done. Now that may just be a literary topos, but I think the interesting thing there is that one of the first things that seems to go when the Roman legions are in, you know, lax mode or complacency is this sort of camp building practice. So I think it's a really interesting device that the Romans used to keep men occupied and keep them, you know, fighting fit without fighting.
And I think for that very reason, there's lots of them in Wales. I mean, you know, if you're a Roman army soldier in Wales, there's not a great deal to do. Of course, there's you know, the highlights of nightlife in Carwent, I suppose. But you know, there's plenty of ground there you can build camps in, and there are lots of them. They're built one on top of the other. And what's intriguing about the ones in Wales particularly is that they're the ones which actually have the redoubts for clearly what was intended to be ballista and catapults. So it's quite exciting. You can actually see the different sort of thinking going into the layouts of camps. You can say, okay, gang, well, today what we're going to do is build something. Oh, do we have to? You can imagine all sorts of interesting scenarios.
But that's really interesting because the other way of arguing is that the Welsh are so warlike and dangerous as foes that there are so many camps surviving because they were such a threat, as opposed to let's go and use Wales for camp building practice. And the evidence for both of those arguments is the same archaeological, survival.
That's why we love the subject so much. There's always two sides, at least two sides.
Right. Speaking on the, let's go a little more deeper on the issue of the legionnaires, because David also posted another question that was related to this, saying that the Roman legionary was also described, of course, since the reforms, 133 BC, if I recall correctly, as Marius's mules. And he asks in specific, how much in the way of campaigning supplies did the legionary carry in days of supply rather than weight? And how does it compare to soldiers of other eras?
My understanding is that Marius is credited with that move of having troops actually carry a substantial portion of their own equipment, because the supply chain, the logistics chain, had got rather long and cumbersome with all these wagons, because clearly they wanted everything to go by horse and wheels. and by actually having people carry on the back, they could actually reduce that number down to a much more uh, manageable problem. I think a legionary is carrying something between 35 and 40 pounds worth of weight, so it's no small weight to be carrying, and it's not even a rucksack or backpack. It's supposedly on these poles which swing, and having done it myself with a reenactment group, if you try to actually march with the shield in your left hand, which has typically got a shield cover, which itself is about 15 pounds, and then you have a two-peeler and one of these strange cross arrangements with this metal can and a bottle and various other bits and pieces and a net and chain and a spade and axe and so forth, you've got to be quite balletic, particularly if you're not marching on a road, if I could go back to that point. So this is where locust-like is a problem. If you're actually a laden-down legionary, Caius Marius style, you can fall over pretty easily and slip over in rivers and so forth. So it's an interesting question. There must have been demonstrable benefits for them to do that, because we see even on Trajan's column, people are still doing it. So something like 200 years, 300 years later, people are still doing it. And I would imagine it's part of the fitness regime. Also, you've got to carry all this stuff, so no slobs in our army, please. I think that's my thoughts on the matter.
It's slightly earlier than the reforms of Marius, of course. If you look at in Greece, some of the stuff that Philip II did of Macedon, of course, was to reform the Macedonian army. One of the things that he did was to have the phalangites, at least, carry part of their supplies on their backs also. I don't remember exactly for how many days. I think it was 3 days or 5 days or something like that, in order to get rid of part of the baggage train, in order to speed up the army, basically, because he realized that the bigger the army is, including everything, including the impediment, the bigger the army is, the slower it moves, of course, and he wanted to make sure that his army was quicker. In order to make it quicker, he had to make it lighter, and that meant that the phalangites, at least, had to carry part of their own supplies. So that basic idea that Marius had already existed earlier. I would hesitate to say that Marius was influenced by Macedonian.
The date of Marius's reform is debated as well, isn't it? As to when it occurs, whether it's actually the Jugurthan War or later. And I think the other thing with the literary topos is that whenever things are going bad for the Roman legionaries, it's because they've become lazy and no longer carry all their own equipment, and they've become soft and used baggage trains again, as opposed to these tough old golden days Roman legionaries who carried all their own equipment.
Which ironically were actually a century before, weren't they? I mean, about sort of 150, 200 BC. So those are the people with the wagons. I mean, the other aspect of it is, you can imagine in the time that the maintenance required to keep a fleet of wagons, whether they're two-wheeled or four-wheeled, is itself quite a burden to have to carry. So if you can have, for example, a mule carry the contubernum tent and some of the heavier items, that saves four wheels and that you've got to maintain. You may also have to have a horse or something to pull the wagon, so that's going to have to be fed. So I can see there's lots of positive benefits to having a man carrying this stuff, and I would imagine that's probably why even in the modern army, men are expected to carry quite a lot of their own material as well. If they get separated from it, they are able to sustain themselves for a period of time, even if it's only a day.
We do know from Josephus that Roman soldiers supposedly carried 3 days of supplies, at least during the Jewish war, and that's about 6 pounds of grain. So, and on top of armor and equipment, that's probably all that you actually would be able to have against someone carry, just like Lindsay said, without falling over on the side. During the Republic, we tend to hear a lot of the army being issued 30 days of grain, which is for a single soldier about 60 pounds. So probably that is being carried on a mule or a wagon, and that's just simply what the army has in its sort of immediate short-term reserves before another shipment comes in from the supply depot. But 3 days at least is what our sources suggest for the days of supply a Roman soldier actually marches with. Although again, that's 100 years after, 200 years almost after Marius.
Interestingly, I saw it 4 or 5 years ago where somebody raised the point about the siege of Masada particularly. One of the mitigating factors on the Roman army having to take that place very fast was, yes, you could bring your grain in and all the rest of it, but what you had a hard time bringing in was the water. The sheer number of gallons of water that you had to have people bring in to keep the army hydrated. So the evidence points to maybe the siege at Masada being over in a very quick order. So we tend not to think of water as being part of the supply chain, but in the hot climates, it absolutely is.
I read a book not too long ago where it said that normally an adult human being requires something like 2 or 3 liters of water, but if you exert yourself in a warm climate, you will need multiple amounts of that, like 6 or 8 liters a day. So if you multiply that with an army of 5,000 men plus everything else, plus the animals, Herodotus' is a statement that the Persian army would.
I think we've exhausted that one now, don't you?
I think this river has also run dry. So, on that note, I think this is a good point to leave it with the podcast. I would very much like to thank our regular panelists, Lindsay Powell, Michael Taylor, and Murray Dunn. And I invite you all, you listeners, to join us again with the next podcast. I don't exactly know when that will be, but hopefully soon.